anything that vaguely looks like work. But it's good to see you. Apologies for the machinations about the organisation's meeting. It seemed that various emails went astray. But anyway, I'm glad to say that we do have Robert Harris here tonight. And I should just say a few words, because Robert is known to some of you but not to others. And if you look at it, is it your website or your DFH Expert is your code name?
DFH Expert is my code name.
And you will not be able to understand that unless you know that DFH is the product code for CICS. Kicks. And Robert spent a good number of years working on that product, as I did. He has been in the habit over many years of giving technical conference presentations, and I think I'm right in saying that they're usually very well rated, and therefore we're counting on him tonight. Now, he came 2 years ago, and I'm sure he'll tell you some more of his deeds, but he came to give us a talk 2 years ago, and that was, I talked about the topic of Android application programming and particular aspects of how it relates. And on that theme tonight, I think, by looking at maybe more than one endpoint. We'll see. And Robert says he's got surprising conclusions. So, over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Chad. Well, my background is on mainframe processing, this thing called KICS, and that basically runs the mainframe world. I was presenting at their annual mainframe conference in the UK a few weeks ago, and people like RBS not had a good time, Tesco were there, British Airways, all the other big banks, all the names you've heard of run this enterprise software. But they're all starting to move into the dreaded mobile space, and they're facing problems. And talking to them afterwards, there's really a culture clash between what might be considered mobile and what might be considered enterprise. And they're not coming to the right answers. So when Jeff asked me to come up with a suitable presentation for you, this is what I lighted on. So I'm now moving away from mainframe transaction processing into sort of talking about how that relates to mobile. And I got this website called StarStats because I'm also kind of moving into analysis of big data. So let's start off with how it used to be. And all these things you knew because you were using a green screen terminal, so you know where it was. You know who was using it, and basically you knew what they were doing with it, and most importantly, power stayed on. Don't have any of this hassle about batteries failing, or something sticking a message out saying, oh, I'm about to shut down because I'm running out of battery no matter what you're doing. None of that. And you had full control from a systems program application design viewpoint. And it was secure, and it was reliable, and you knew nothing nasty was going on. And you knew that certain times of the day were free, so you could do other things. None of which apply nowadays. We're now moving into the 24/7 environment, and you've got to cope with power failures, and you've got to cope with the fact you don't know who it is, and you've got the fact that you could be doing it on a train and going through a tunnel and signal gets cut off mid-usage. So we really, when you look back to mainframe days, we had it easy. Because we relied on all these things, and they don't work anymore. So I'm going to ask you now, who's got an Android phone? About half. What about an Apple phone? A couple. What about an Android pad?
No, I do have
Well, pretty few of you. Apple pad? More of you. Okay. So there isn't a conclusion amongst you between the difference between telephony devices and data devices, which is one of the things that I came to a conclusion about preparing this presentation. I kept rewriting it until I came to this conclusion, that telephony is different from data. So I am going to come to a conclusion about one of these top three is best for enterprise computing in the mobile space. I'm either going to come down to Android, Apple, or Windows. Now, I'm going to test your prejudices again. Am I going to go for Android? Nobody thinks that. Am I going to go for Apple? Nobody thinks that. Does that mean to say you're all going to go for Windows? I don't think that either. Well, so, your considered view as experts in the field is the fact there's no outstanding operating system environment and mobile device. So, neither did I when I was setting up for this, but I have to come to a conclusion. So,
Do you mean that this is when you choose the thing, it's what the enterprise is going to buy a fleet of for its
yes.
salespeople to go
Yes.
around it? Okay, because actually a lot of people are just going to come up with whatever they got, aren't they?
yeah, and this talk is going to say this is an amazingly bad thing for both you and the company. Bring your own device may well be a la mode, it's what that people like doing, but from an enterprise viewpoint, it sucks. And from your viewpoint, it says, okay, you're going to use that at work, your organisation is going to be able to access every single thing on it. Because of legal reasons, audit reasons.
Can you distinguish between transactional apps and office type apps?
No.
You can't.
The two are converging.
Right.
Coming from a mainframe environment, email is different from something which updates data. But having said that, if you have a company email on your device, that allows the company to get in. So it's really a subset of privacy. And I am going to argue that is not good news for you as an owner of such a device. I'm also going to argue, kind of, that it's a bad thing for the company viewpoint, because then there's all sorts of privacy issues which you start to run into. Then you start to run into legal and data protection. If you're American, running into Sarbanes-Oxley and all this kind of stuff. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and this is why my conclusion is somewhat strange. Anyway, so I'm going to come up with Android, Apple, or Windows. And Windows, I mean proper Windows. I don't mean Windows RT, and I don't mean Windows Mobile. And various other things that have come and gone recently, there's absolutely no chance. For example, Firefox. We're using crowdfunding for a Unix-type browser. Didn't make it. Chrome. Who wants Chrome? Chrome's based on HTML. Not good enough. So these are the reasons why the ones I don't like or like on the previous slide I have ruled out completely. First of all, they've got to be around. And I suppose in the long term we're talking about 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years at most. Browser, yeah, because that's how long enterprise apps tend to last for, 5 years or so. Browser methodology is distinctly unhelpful, especially as it's restricted to the CSS box model. HTML5 doesn't provide enterprise characteristics, and all of this stuff is more of an interim solution. I'm old enough to remember when NTT Docomo was being touted as the next coming thing, because HTML on the web page was obviously slow, yucky, and horrible. And look what happened to that. So I'm of the opinion that anything that relies on HTML and CSS is not good enough for enterprise apps.
Can you just dig in a little bit and tell us which enterprise characteristics?
The CSS model still basically relies on RPC. In other words, you send something off to the host, get something back, and splurge out some data. I don't think that's good enough.
But HTML doesn't.
HTML5 still relies on that as a presentation. HTML5 and CSS is merely presentation.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide any asynchronous interfaces, doesn't provide you with the ability to schedule threads and all that kind of stuff. It's merely presentation. Now, looking back through your session history, you had a presentation on Java and how newer Java ways of displaying things work. That's still relying on the good old-fashioned RPC model to drive it. I don't think for enterprise apps, have a screen, get some data off it, send it off to the back end, get the result, update the picture, which is basically what CSS and HTML5 gives you, is good enough. Yes?
So isn't HTML5 really, shouldn't it be understood as HTML5 plus JavaScript?
Yeah. Now, I also have a prejudice against JavaScript as well. Not too surprisingly. Interesting, last week's Sunday Telegraph, they had one of the Ask the Expert type sessions for the user-based community, and it said, stay well away from anything to do with Java, which is a sentiment I heartily agree with. As we will come to see.
JavaScript hasn't got anything to do with Java.
No, JavaScript is mainly noticing when you hit a particular field on the screen and doing something.
Yeah.
Again, that's not particularly enterprisable, because if you hit something on the screen and it goes off and does RPC, what happens in the meantime if you hit another field which goes off and does something? And you can't stop that happening very easily in JavaScript. So anything which kind of relies on front-end data manipulation, I don't like. Now, you could legitimately argue that's because my mainframe background doesn't permit that. But also from a transaction viewpoint, and I'll come to explain one definition of a transaction, that is unhelpful. Because there are certain times when something is happening at the enterprise level, you want to stop it happening at the user level. And it's very, very difficult to achieve that with HTML. So that's sort of why I don't like that.
So the main problem is that it doesn't have a turnaround model like the old terminals.
Yes.
It's capable of being interactive.
Yes. Now, back in fashion, good old green screen terminals, when you hit a key which did something, which was enter, or you had 24 keys which did something, or even 3 keys which didn't send the data and you had a clear key, that meant the terminal got locked until something came back. And if you're familiar with it, there was a little X that appeared at the bottom left-hand corner. Now, that X sometimes could be just got rid of by hitting the reset key, and sometimes it couldn't. But in both cases, it said something's going on, user input is not allowed. And that turned out to be very good, because you being the program in this case, was in control of the display apparatus, and therefore you could say, nothing's happening now, I'm doing it. Very, very useful, but also very important to stop multiple things happening when you didn't really want them to. Yes?
Why can't you do that with HTML5? So
You can't.
you make a request, it kicks off an asynchronous process.
But it doesn't lock the screen.
No, but you have state on your server.
No,
Which,
you have state on your server, you don't have state on the browser.
yeah, so you have state on your server, so if a new request comes in.
Yes, but
you
what
reject
happens?
it.
But then, you're absolutely right there, but then you get race conditions.
Why would you have a race condition?
Because, in generally speaking, if you're trying to do something on the back end and you send another request into it before the first is finished, that's classic bad programming.
No, it's just parallel programming, right?
Ah.
So you can start a process, and then you can observe that process while it's running.
Can you? How do you do that?
You have state.
You don't have state. You don't have state in HTML5.
No, but in the server,
You have it in the server, but then you've got to make sure you police it correctly. And what happens if the second request comes in mainly case you've got to wait it, normally what you do. And then what happens if the first one updates the screen so that the second usage is in out?
So you'd be controlling that using messages or something like that. So you kick off a process, it puts a message onto a queue, other messages come in. Is there already an existing message on the queue? Yes, send back the screen saying there's one in flight.
But what happens to the user when the second one gets rejected?
They get a screen that says you already have on your flight, or you draw your little X in the bottom.
But don't you think that's a bit impolite?
Well, it's the same as your green screen terminal.
No, it isn't. Green screen terminal won't accept the second input.
No, exactly. You have no input at all. You have no control.
Yes, and what I'm going to argue is that for enterprise computing, that's exactly what you want.
You want to block your user.
Yes.
But surely you have local staging JavaScript.
I know, and that's one of the reasons I don't like it.
But that local state can give you what you're asking for, can't it?
But the problem with that is race conditions and double updates. Now, this is my opinion, and it's my opinion coming from the enterprise background. Your opinion may be different. But the critical thing is, whatever design model you adopt, you're going to have to code and set the user expectations accordingly. And I, from my basic background, is if you don't allow any second input, it's a lot easier. You may disagree. Yes?
Oh, we just stick up a processing page, so when you kick off a operation that takes a bit of time to execute on the server, just stick up a processing page, obviously blocks any additional user in turn. They have to sit there and wait for the result to come back.
Indeed, I have tried to do that on Android. And Android, certain times, won't bother to display it. Exceedingly annoying. But this is one of the problems with Android. It's not really... Interesting enough, on Apple, there's an API on Apple which says, I want to swap myself between threads. And therefore you can stick yourself onto the main thread and update your screen. It's easier on Apple than it is on Android.
We just might put a GIF up, so it's just essentially an image.
But can you guarantee it gets there?
Well,
Yes. Well, it's the problem.
yeah, that's what you can't. And then if it doesn't get there, then they look at it and put it
Ah, but this is the difference, you see. When you're talking about from an enterprise viewpoint, you don't have these uncertainties. It's either there or it's not. Now, there is a user community difference here, which can be argued. I'm a staid, old, boring person who likes things to be secure and safe and know what's going on. And the user community now doesn't have that restriction. But that's a design issue.
But now let's just, I mean, I think you're taking a position, Robert, and that's fine. But we could test that. I mean, there's any number of web shopping applications around that treat a browser as if it were a terminal.
Yes.
And most of them put up very helpful messages like, do not press the back button.
Yes, they do.
Right. So my question is, what's the exposure? What's the risk? What can go wrong?
Looking at it from my viewpoint, from the enterprise viewpoint, is if I see a message like that, I don't really want to wait. I hate it when it does that. And I go, why am I waiting, why am I waiting, why am I waiting? I would rather it, and I'm going to press the back button anyway. So I think it's gone, it's had it. From an enterprise viewpoint space, from a traditional transaction viewpoint, that's absolutely the last thing you want to do. And my view on this, which I'll come to later, is you stop those happening at the API level, i.e. the user interaction level. That's my take on it.
But I mean, is it fair to say that in those web shopping applications, the application is trying to simulate a terminal model, usually?
It is. And the problem with that is it can't stop you doing stuff.
Right. So it's not robust.
It's not robust. No. I remember on the first slide I said, you don't power off, you know what's going on. In that type of situation, you shut your browser down, which you can do. Your transaction, your order, or whatever it is, may or may not work. Mm. And looking at it from an enterprise viewpoint, may or may not is an extremely bad thing. You don't think you care if it doesn't work.
But we have always had Windows.
We've always had Windows.
I don't mean Microsoft.
But we know how to recover from those Windows.
Yeah.
The recovery aspect, the resolution of what's called in doubt, is a very big thing on enterprise computing. Anyway, let me go on. The reason I don't like the Unix ones is because it's an external display manager. Many times on my little Unix box, sometimes it goes into a state where it refuses to do anything at all and I have to shut down, or it suddenly goes into a disk write loop, mainly caused by X not being responsive. So you can't have any of that. Also, telephony. Telephony is not a prime usage for enterprise apps. Now that means using a traditional phone call.
How can you say that?
Yeah.
It's just these people are salesmen. They're going around all the time.
No. Just hang on. Yes. Hello. I'll come to this later. So I'm talking about enterprise apps for usage within an organisation by your own employees. So therefore you can impose things. If you're deploying for customers, there aren't any rules at all. And you've got to put up with all sorts of nasty stuff. Yes?
Sorry, what's your definition of enterprise?
What's my definition of enterprise? Yes, I should have mentioned this. I mean running stuff which probably exists at the moment and running that through a mobile device.
So legacy applications, pre-existing.
We don't use the term legacy. But yes, traditional applications that run well. But if you are deploying for customers, your decision is going to be different, and there are a whole lot more nasty things you're going to have to put up with and potentially get round. Now, I was talking to Mr. IT at Tesco at this user group meeting a few weeks ago, and he's very proud of the fact that Tesco employees can whip out their mobile phone, take a picture of the barcode, and display everything about a product on the shelf. So I said, oh yes, can they do updates? And the answer was, oh, certainly not. And I said, oh yeah, okay, what sort of mobile phones do you cope with? And he said, oh, we had a big problem because we got to cope with all sorts of screen sizes. And Apple and Android, we don't do Windows. We don't do BlackBerry. So I said, okay, so you've got an app for an Apple iPhone and an Android iPhone. That's what it comes down to, and the answer is yes. And how do you cope with the different screen sizes? It's a pain. You code to the smallest screen size. That's not good, but there you go, that's what we do. Anyway, so if you're deploying for customers, you've got to put up with all this kind of stuff, which we can come to later. So, the point I'm generally making about enterprise apps is something we've been saying for ages and years. Presentation and logic must be separate. The traditional design technique. And the operating system must support proper multi-threading and coordination with the back-end processing. And what I mean by that is that the transaction, which I've defined as a traditional unit of work thing, which means all updates happen or they don't, should extend to the device. In other words, if you send a message out to the device, which is maybe updating state in there, well, I'm not talking about state in specific terms, generally you update something, you better make sure that that update agrees with what's on the mainframe. Because if they get out of step, problems will start arising. Now that's the desire. Now, for example, when you take money out of a cash point, if you don't take it out, the cash out of the cash point, the transaction, which is updating your account on the mainframe, fails. And it just won't appear. So in other words, the transaction has extended to the ATM.
And the money is taken back.
And the money is taken back in, and it goes slurp. And you may read that when that happens, somebody notices, and bad coding in the past means that that money has disappeared from your account. And you've been reading something on Moneybox, for example, that says, finally, after 20 years or so, you get your money back. But IBM, when it invented the ATM, and when we're running through this enterprise system called GIGS. The unit of work extended to the terminal, and therefore the terminal dishing out the money and your bank account were going to be consistent and correct. And that's called transaction unit of work. Now, if you can't get that out to the device, then you've got a code for compensation on the back end. In other words, you haven't got specific notification from the user that whatever it is you've done has been taken notice of or has finished. Remember that example about please don't press the back button on your browser, or really, really, really doing something about it? If you shut the browser at that point, the back end may complete or it may not complete, but you don't know. The transaction avoids that issue. So if the transaction extends to the device and the device powers off and the transaction has failed, the back-end data has not got updated. If that happens and the transaction doesn't extend to the device, then somehow you've got to notice on the back-end that whatever it's doing has not completed and you better start updating it. And that's called compensation. And there's most of the textbooks about that high. I remember reviewing for IBM, 3 of them came to that about all these models and how you cope with it. Kind of take for granted that thread and IP management are required on the mobile device.
So what is IP management?
I mean, basically not swapping between sockets randomly. It also means, on occasion, not keeping a socket open. So you need to manage all of that, and encrypted IP goes without saying. Okay, if you're going to mobile, you're going to be encrypted. You're updating stuff, you know. So obvious, you just don't bother to worry about it. And I'm just going to put a couple of slides on there about how the back-end enterprise environment will work. First of all, I'm happy to say XML is dead. The Java community have now come up with good old-fashioned mainframe processing techniques and shoved your data into a structure. And they called it J, because everything starts with J now, with JSON, and essentially send a set of key equals values up. You don't wrap them all up in XML because it's a smaller flow. However, that has significant advantages, the fact that you don't have to check it when it arrives at the back end. Lots of strange things happen if you don't check your XML for completeness and accuracy. Now that takes a lot of processing time to check an XML flow against its schema. In IBM mainframe terms, that's too big a something to do on the main processing. So IBM mainframes have these things called speciality engines, which are called ZAPs. And one of the things that run on them is checking that an XML flow agrees with the XML schema. It just takes so long to do, and you're stopping mainframe usage of normal stuff. So the Java community finally realised that XML is not a good thing.
That's with all the XML compilation and binding technologies. It still takes too long.
Yeah, it still takes too long. Now, because it takes too long, certain people who I would regard as foolish don't bother to check it. And therefore, any problems which arise are tough.
But you're still going to parse it. And that,
You're still going to parse it.
That's a big overhead.
And that's an even bigger overhead.
Yeah.
That just isn't, it just isn't nice. I mean, I've written parsing routines in various languages and all the rest of it, and none of them are nice. So when JSON comes along, you can actually stick a structure on top of a flow and process it just normally, as if it was a data flow. And because it just equals values, you can put a security certificate, X, whatever it is you like on there. You can also put your own meta information in there as well, obviously. And that has the advantage that your host security manager can use that to decide various things. And the general recommendation is the fact you never interfere and try to put your own code at the back end on the host. to do security processing. That's what external security managers are there for. So the external security manager, given the JSON flow, which you can quite happily have access to, can decide yes or no, whether or not the operation is authorized. And in IBM terms, that's RUCF. If you're into computer associates, it's ACF2 and CA secure. Any of the mainframe external things. So, a couple of slides on how you range from your mobile device to talk to your back-end enterprise. So the first thing, you'd go something like that, and you'd have a something or other which is called KICS, this thing called transaction processing, which would run a Java something or other, which would interpret the flow and then go off and do something else with it. Bad news, because you're actually letting the flow into your secure systems, and you're therefore vulnerable to attack, denial of service, all that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing. So you don't like that. So the next go is you establish a demilitarized zone, and you stick the reception of the flow from the mobile device in there, extract whatever it is that's in there, check it, validate it, and then pass it on to your secure backend systems to do something. The DMZ or DMZ doesn't have any access to any secure data at all, so any hacking attempt will fail because there's nothing in there to get hold of. So the critical thing here is this arrow there, which says establish a flow to your back-end system. You cannot possibly go across that little arrow through a hack. So that's better, so no nasty things can access your system. And even better, and this is where I admit IBM pays my list, most big institutions that are taking stuff in from outside have a hardware box in the firewall, which aims to prevent nastiness happening. So you have this hardware device in there which filters and checks and establishes policies and does all sorts of other things. But I've also got rid of the JVM, because if you're using JSON, I said you can stick a structure on it and access it through COBOL, or assembler, or PR1, or C. Now that means you don't have Java in the way. Now various attacks in the Java space work by you running off the end of a buffer and data being interpreted as code. If you're running Java in there, yeah, you're relying on the integrity of your JVM provider to stop that happening. Some people take the view of it as, well, there's always going to be perhaps in facilities in there. So if you're running a COBOL program, that cannot happen. So you're much securer by running a traditional 3PL type processing thing to extract the data out of the flow and then pass it on to your backend system to do something. And that is a secure way of doing things. Now, I admit to a prejudice here, but IBM would not like this picture at all, because there's a thing called WebSphere, which is designed to do all sorts of every single thing to do with the web that you could possibly imagine. I have never liked it, and that is my prejudice. Because with KICS, you're running traditional programs in there, and therefore you're a lot securer, in my view.
If you substituted C for COBOL in there, how would you feel about that?
I'm okay with that, because I know that when C, bad code, overruns a buffer area, I know that protections within KICS can cope with that without bringing the whole system down. It may well crunch what you're doing, which is quite happy, but that's it. It doesn't affect anybody else. Now, that means a classic buffer overrun attack will fail for two reasons. First of all, your structure, which you're sticking on the flow, or limit the number of bytes you can receive, and anything else will corrupt the data. But as it's a traditional COBOL program, you're not going to take any notice of it anyway. If you do something in there and you've got dopey code, you will crunch that single request, but the KICS region and back-end processing will continue. It will just stop that individual thing. Now, there's been a lot of effort put in over the years to stop that happening. And the traditional web server is very, very, in my view, subject to these kind of attacks. But because you're putting it into a non-traditional processing from the viewpoint of hackers, they are not going to know that you're running within KICS COBOL. And whatever attack they will try will fail. Because the software, the mainframe software, just doesn't allow them to do that. And this is one of the reasons why I'm against Java, because the attacks are predicated on certain things, and running a Java backend is one of them.
Well, is this not just a question of maturity then?
Yes.
So if you wait 15 years, then you can maybe have two options.
Hey, indeed 15 years, but there again, we're all going to be dead in 15 years, aren't we, from the processing viewpoint. But this is coming from an enterprise background. This is my background. People who are coming from the web sphere, a bit of IBM will say this is absolute rubbish, and people who write apps will equally say you so automation, you're not with it. However, we oldies know how to cope with massive volume and make sure that request A does not crunch request B if request A drops something nasty. I think this idea and technique has yet to make it into the more modern ways of thinking about things. However, I fully admit this is a prejudice. And you will no doubt disagree with me, which is good, because then you can come up with ways of saying, this is my prejudice, and here's a good reason why it's silly.
So let's just look at this box, this hardware gateway box.
Yes.
That presumably is a System Z architecture, is it?
No.
It isn't. So it could run something other than KICS.
Yes, it's not, the hardware box is not actually running anything.
Right.
It's a hardware gateway to prevent denial of service attacks, to check various things and enforce policies.
Right.
So you can say, if it's request type A, we want to route it to backend A. If it's request type B, well, we'll route it off somewhere else. But
So
you can
I
also
don't quite
do
understand
security.
where the application code goes, because you're implying there's application code in there.
No, I'm not.
Well, that's what it looks like.
Well, I'm afraid that is incorrect in my slide presentation in that case.
All right.
There is not application code running in the hardware box. There is a lot of checking and policing of policies going on in there, but there is no real application code. If it gets past the hardware firewall, it then goes into application code.
But there is translation from the key value pairs to something else.
If you want to do that.
And is that a built-in function of the box, or is that something you have to do in the...
No, it's built-in function of the box, but in general, I think people use the box simply to say this flow looks all right, pass it through.
So the translation will probably happen in the other box.
The translation will happen in the brownish box. The translation
Oh, I'm sorry,
between
that's
JSON. So you get the JSON in there.
I'm sorry, I'm misreading that. Right. So
Sorry.
this is application code in DMZ
Yes.
rather than in the box itself.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, that's not made clear.
So there is no operating system in the box?
Sorry?
There is operating system in the box, or no?
No, it's no operate. It's not a processing box as such. I mean, this data power box, data power was bought by IBM about 10 years ago, I think. So.
But
And it's purely there
is it
to.
like firmware?
Well, sorry?
Like code of firmware?
Yes, something like
It
that.
has firmware in it.
It's got firmware in it, yes.
But it is running an operating system, but it's just you don't load your own
Yes.
custom programs into it.
Correct.
You can only configure it to do
Yes.
translation of things like XML and parsing XML and
Yes.
converting inputs and so on.
And there, for some strange reason, there comes in two colours, an orange one and a yellow one, and they do something slightly different. The reasons I never quite understood.
But your little orange square to the right of the data power box, that's another instance of kicks, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Running on
Okay.
something that runs kicks.
Yes.
You don't really care what.
No. I don't care what. No. But the critical thing about this slide is that the secure systems are shielded from the outside world, and that the flow between the orange box and the yellow box is translated from what comes into the input to what's acceptable for the back end.
I don't want to hold you out, Robert, but I have this question, which is what happened to RBS last week?
I know what happened to RBS, but I can't tell you.
They'll shoot you.
Yes. But I
Give
can.
us a clue.
But I can tell you what happened last time with RBS.
It was a DDoS, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a DDoS.
So they probably weren't doing it.
They haven't got that sort of stuff in there.
Right.
I can tell you what happened at the previous failure about RBS, and that essentially was human error.
Right.
And that was basically called, no, I'm not going to say that because it's been published in general. We'll tell you about that offline, in case somebody sues me. But yes, this idea of RBS systems are woefully behind the times is untrue. This thing that there's not been a lot of investment in systems over the past, which is why they keep going down all the time, I don't think is, well, I just don't like it. I mean, I know RBS runs a huge number of back-end systems, and I know their reliability is pretty good. And that's all I
But
think.
it might also be true that they haven't invested as much as they should have done.
I couldn't possibly comment on that, and I'm not going to.
You're actually implying that with your answer.
I'm not implying anything.
Yeah, because they didn't put this box in.
I'm not implying anything. So I'm on YouTube. Hello, it's RBS. No, I'm not implying anything.
I also have worked in RBS, so I.
Well, you can say that. I can't.
I have some. Right, go on.
Yeah, right. Now, this picture I pinched from The Economist a few weeks back, and this was to do with promotion and people hierarchies and all the rest of it. So the people in the middle were being squeezed by the oldies staying on and the hip youngsters coming up from above. But it also rather neatly illustrates what I want to talk about here. That the baby boomers, i.e. sort of my age-ish type thing, were brought up on mainframes. Generation X, next one down, were PC types. And the younger lot, which are Generation Y, come in through tablets. And you can see them all using their wonderful tablets and their cups of coffee. And the millennials are even worse, even younger, because they're always on. But this interesting picture shows something else. And that's the younger lot having two devices. One for telephony and one for data. So, what I was saying earlier on, and you all said rubbish, was that telephony is different from data. It is, and you can see that picture shows it. Now, the squeezed middle, the Generation X lot, do look fairly unhappy there, because they've been overtaken technologically by the younger generation, who are into tablets and mobile. The baby boomers are all going to die off anyway, sooner or later. But the critical thing is that different generations have different interface expectations. So if you're writing an enterprise app, you've got to code for all of them. And it's not as trivial as you might expect. Even something as trivial as what's the size of your finger means that it influences what you put on the real estate screen display. So you kind of got to think about your end user display for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is the disability issue, which is becoming more and more important. So you can't go for something really terrifically snazzy because all your user community may not be able to use it. So you say, okay, let's have one snazzy interface for the younger lots and have something slightly different from the older. That's equally fine, but that's double your coding effort for the user interface. Doesn't affect the back-end processing, but it does affect the user interface experience. So, when I was writing this presentation, this question was not foremost in my mind. And when it had reached the foremost in my mind, the presentation kind of solidified itself. And the answer is, do you need voice on the same box as data? In other words, on your tablet, you're doing all your enterprise computing stuff, your user interface, your WYSIWYG, your email, all the rest of it. Do you want voice? And the answer is probably not. If you've got a tablet, that's nice like that, you're not holding that up to your ear to do it. Similarly, if you've got a small voice telephone, you're not going to put an enterprise app on that because the screen size is too small. So the critical thing here is you mustn't, if at all possible, have voice on whatever device you're using for enterprise applications. Yeah, hang on, no, hang on, you were first. Yes, go on.
Well, just to say, if you were doing conference calling, that would be, you'd need the tablet. And maybe if you're, for example,
conference calling,
if
yes.
you're a district nurse.
Yes, but conference calling is not telephony.
Well, it may include.
No. Telephony is voice only, in my definition.
Oh, well.
When you say Skype is telephony on enterprise,
I would be very inclined to say if you've got a need for teleconferencing along with your enterprise app, you would stick that on your tablet. I'm purely talking about voice when I use telephony. Because if you're going to have telephony, you're going to hold it up to your ear.
Yeah.
And that limits your screen size.
It's nothing near the truth.
Sorry?
Telephony might be big, might be small, size of the device has nothing to do with the system that you hear with the voice.
You're absolutely right. But my viewpoint is, if you want to do telephony, you want small handheld. If you've got small handheld, you haven't got a decent enough screen size to do your enterprise app on it.
If you want to be truly mobile, surely you want a smaller device as well. So if you're like a telephone engineer going up, what they're called, I forget the name, the post. You want something that's, you can hang off your belt or something rather than
Indeed. But are you doing that for convenience of screen size, or are you doing it because you need voice?
Size, I would say, but I thought that was the argument, was that telephony, if you wanted, one of the main reasons was that you wanted to do telephony, that's the only reason you'd have a small device, otherwise go for a tablet.
Because I don't think you can hold a tablet up to your ear and talk to it.
Yeah,
no,
I think
that's what I mean by voice. Now, you can quite happily stick it in front of you and do Skype video conferencing, but that's not telephony, in my definition.
I think you just got to remember that in Africa, people are doing mobile banking on old-fashioned Nokia handsets.
Indeed, and they use text messages to exchange data. They don't use data commands.
They're not using voice.
They're not using voice.
No.
But remember, the premise I said was employees within your own organisation doing things for you. Now, that's a small subset of the possibilities. My view, for better or for worse, is too small screen for enterprise apps. You may disagree, but all the things I'm going to talk about next, you will also disagree with. But my brief here is to stimulate debate. And some of you are going, oh, he's useless, which is good, because then you're addressing some of the issues and thinking ways around it. And coming from the enterprise ancient application space, some of these issues which I'm going to talk about next, you probably need to think about and come up with your own solutions. So if you do need telephony, then that straight away gives you Android and Apple. And you've got to cope with maybe insecurity on that as well. And small devices, smaller viewpoints. Yes?
Little question. You were absolutely right when you said that for different age group we have to have different interfaces. And why we don't deliberate it further for your different devices? The small device we have incorporated.
If you have a, yes. If you have a small device, you put three fields on it. Yeah.
The small device.
Yes.
Simplify it.
Well, when I was
exactly the same with policy, but playing with interfaces, that's it.
Yes, but you can quite legitimately say that's playing with interface, and you select the interface based on the device. Or you do it the other way around.
Why not? If IBM bought for its own purpose a big device for big guys and small device for small guys, it's exactly adjusted interface to small device, but it's still not the same IBM, the same security. All the rest is fine.
Yes, but so but the critical thing here is you're going to therefore duplicate code to fit it onto the different device sizes. Is that a good use of your coding resource? Maybe so.
That's the benefit of HTML5.
But I've already decided why I don't like HTML5.
But it's a point back in its favour.
It is indeed a point back in its favour. There's also the problem of the fact you insist on vertical portrait orientation.
But memory is cheap these days, so what's the worry about duplication?
Sorry, what can you say?
Memory is cheap.
Memory is cheap.
What's the problem about duplication of something?
Memory is cheap, but therefore coding resource isn't. This is not a memory issue in terms of utilising space on the device, or even the size of the app on the device. It's an issue relating to how much it costs your programmers to do it. Yes?
With tablets, there's a problem of also the temperature at which you're operating.
We talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, because of the if it's cold, the screen isn't going to respond to your fingers.
I know. I haven't talked about that because that essentially is common to all of them. Therefore, that doesn't really.
Well, no, if you've actually got buttons rather than the screen, it doesn't matter what temperature.
Ah. Yes, now that is a very interesting issue. I have.
My friend yesterday.
Yes, I have implicitly assumed soft keyboard. Now, I haven't talked in these slides about what happens if you need a physical keyboard. I kind of assumed that this is going to be Bluetooth attached and all the rest of it. But I'm also assuming that your app has to be written so that it does be keyboard friendly. Now, I am going to claim, perhaps unjustifiably, that that comes out as a side effect of the accessibility issues.
This may well be solved, and if you use anywhere with gestures, for example.
It might be solved with gestures. However, I don't think that gestures are going to be good enough for the accessibility requirements thing. Google Glass with blinking does have possibilities, but Google Glass doesn't seem to want to link up with an app on a device as yet. If that comes in, I think the accessibility people will be quite pleased. No, don't forget, I listen to Does He Take Sugar, or whatever it is, on Radio 4, week by week. And they are always whinging on about things like, oh, the version 5 of my device did this, version 6 didn't, and I'm going to have to buy version 6A, which cost me 50 quid more. And they don't like that. And when I say, well, tough, you've got to pay 50 quid, that's solve it, but paying extra doesn't work. So your app, when you write it, by default has to be accessible for everybody. Now, you cannot insist on a physical keyboard. And therefore, you cannot insist, I would claim, that your device has a physical keyboard attached to it, i.e. the BlackBerry solution. I mean, one of my old Nokias has a keyboard in it. Very useful it was on occasion, because you could just sat there, go tip on a small keyboard and put things in. So, but no devices at the moment insist on physical keyboards. Now with Apple and Android and Windows, you can buy cases that give you a keyboard, Bluetooth connect, or via secret socket connect, that's fine. But that means your app has to be written to cope with it. which means your app can't rely on prods on the screen. And it also means you can't rely on long press and short press distinctions either. Right then, I'm now going to come up with a series of sort of questions that I've asked myself, which lead me to my conclusion. So, identification is a big issue. Now, user IDs and passwords are a waste of space. Insecure, too easy to crack. You can get yourself a commercial cracking thing. Just for fun, I downloaded it and see how long it took to check some of my passwords, and they were a bit on the feeble side. There you go. Fingerprints, biometrics, available on Apple. Getting there on Android, I think. Now, fingerprints is a bit of a problem for Apple because you read about the privacy concerns about the NSA nicking your biometrics. And Apple said, well, they're only stored on the device. Well, that's all very well, except that means you can't actually use them on the back-end host. So that's not totally good. Facial recognition is another possibility. Most devices have a front camera. So you could locate that processing on the device or on the host or both. And that has the advantage that no particular user action is needed to do it. So if you're writing an app, you could insist on user ID and password put in every time you want to use the thing. Nobody would put up with that. So there's always going to be some sort of window where security might be breached. And therefore, you've somehow got to cope with that.
Can you not delegate authentication to the device?
Somebody nicks your device.
It still requires your card.
Yes, do you do it every time?
Drop your thumb.
Do you do it every 5 times? Do you every 10 minutes? You're going to have a lot of upset people if you require it frequently. So somehow you've got to cope around that. And this is a problem. It doesn't matter so much if you're not doing business critical stuff. If you are doing business critical stuff and your authentication, your security breaks down, that is extremely bad news. Headlines saying somebody's stolen all user ID and passwords from device X, bad news, share price drops dead, directors have to resign, all that kind of stuff. So you've got to cope with this somehow. So you will see that this leads on into my conclusions. I'm also going to say use IPv6. Forget about IPv4 for all sorts of good reasons, not the least of which IPv6 permits multicast. So you can use it to send out oh dear type things, or super duper tell your customers for the next 57 seconds they can do this and get an amazing back something. Supported on all the devices. It's even more secure because most of the attacks assume IPv4. And those of you familiar with IPv6 know that the leftmost 4 hex digits, the top things, can be used to restrict access. So you can have an IPv6 address that only says for them access is only permitted with your own network, and that's policed by routers and all sorts of other things. So you can use the top bit of an IPv6 address to increase your security as well. So if you get an IPv6 address flow coming in from an IPv6 address which has a global address, you can simply reject that straight away. That increases your security. So that kind of helps with denial of service attacks. I also have a thing against interpretive code. I do not like interpretive code on my device. So I have this thing that somebody can get in and change it. Now this is all coming from an enterprise background. There's this wonderful language called Rex, which is interpretive, and a lot of stuff runs on the mainframe with interpretive Rex. But you can compile that and get around the problem.
It's never been used in business applications.
No, but I've written stuff with Rex for this Kicks thing and published it out quite happily. And you can go in there and extend it all the rest of it. So I also think that as it is interpretive, as I was saying earlier on, it's liable to some sort of whizzy hack that somehow manages to inject your own code in there. People tell me that issuing SQL calls, dodgy data sent in through an HTML get or put statement causes problems. You stick something on there which immediately goes into an SQL statement and it says 1 equals 1, which is a selection criteria, and all sorts of nasty stuff happens. I just kind of think that's easier to do with Android and Java. That's a prejudice, but I just do not like interpretive Java code, because for all sorts of reasons, and that's one of them. However, Android 4.4 kind of gets around that by doing a first-time compile. Now replacing their runtime with 4.4 with the newer one, which interprets Java code, and like the mainframe JVMs, it does a first-time compile.
So you're saying that bytecode, Java bytecode is easier to patch than, say, 86 code or something?
Yes, absolutely so,
Okay.
in my viewpoint. And therefore, if you're running an enterprise app, you can quite happily insist on Java not being around anywhere to get around some of these vulnerabilities. Now, that means on your device, you might think Java is unwise, which means Android might be unwise. Or you might consider I'm just being paranoid and daft, and who cares?
Does this mean you like C#?
I don't particularly like C, but I like it better than Java.
C#.
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 Because that has a compile.
That has a compile, and it's,
Okay.
that's why I said variants of C++.
It's C# is interpreted or bytecode, isn't it? It runs on the VM.
But you can compile it.
Yeah, well, you have to compile it.
Yes.
It doesn't have a JVM.
It doesn't have it.
It runs on a VM.
It can run under a VM, but you can compile it as well.
If you insist, you can also compile Java.
Yeah.
You can compile Java, but I don't think you can get that to run on Android. I may be wrong, but I was looking at this a few weeks ago. I haven't found any evidence of it. You might know better than me. In which case, that's a rule. But I know with Android 4.4, the compilation happens on the device, and therefore it's better.
Sorry, what is it compiling?
It's compiling Java bytecode into essentially machine instructions. And they say that the compiling and the newer Arch runtime is a significant performance improvement.
Isn't that kind of, I understand what you're saying, but isn't that kind of removed by the fact that people have mobile devices? So in fact, it could be, it doesn't have to be a fake. Somebody could have their PC and have a program running because you've exposed an external interface. I can see where, you have on your desktop or something, you expect that to be a secure environment. But
Indeed. Absolutely right. There are no guarantees anything in this mobile space, and that's part of the problem. And this is why I'm going to have to very reluctantly at the end of this talk come to a conclusion. And what I'm trying to do today is raise all these questions and the answers I've come up with, which I hope you will disagree with, because you will come up with a better answer for your organisation. So that's why I don't like Java, and that means I don't like Android. But there may be other considerations which I'm going to come to. I also don't like Unix. And Unix is the base for iOS as also Android. Why don't I like Unix? Because it's just not secure. If you come from a mainframe environment, there are a lot more things you can do with security, and Unix fails to meet most of these criteria. And I just don't think ACLs are good enough. And you can promote yourself to root via a ruse and do anything you feel like. And that's why I don't like Unix. But that's one of them, that's a prejudice. I just don't like Unix. Mainly because on my Unix laptop it sometimes drops dead on me. And on my Android tablet, sometimes it drops dead, goes into a spin loop. Okay, and you kind of look at the diagnostics and you stick it into the development environment and see what it's coming up with, and it's something Unixy. So I have a prejudice against Unix. This is not surprising based on my enterprise mainframe background. That is a prejudice. But that's a question you need to address. On your enterprise platform, mobile platform, you've got to do provisioning. So you've got to provide ways to make sure you update with fixes, your apps get updated, maybe security. You've got to make sure all those have happened to everybody. You've also got to do remote wipe if the device gets nicked. You've got to maybe enforce batch windows. If you've got enterprise apps, sometimes this thing may not be available all the day. For various reasons, you have to record and audit everything. And if you send out certain messages, you've got to make sure somebody's received them. This is not sort of email-ish. It's not sort of Skype-type communication thing. It means you send something out, you've got to make sure you've got it somehow. This is sort of verging into more of the middleware type things. But this is what you've got to do. So this is somehow your provisioning, however you do it, it's got to do this sort of stuff. So that's not particularly device dependent, but this is somehow your environment that's got to do this. I've talked about the runtime environment for the back end of the enterprise environment. I've talked about transactions. On the back end of the enterprise environment, or either all your updates, wherever you happen to do them, work or not. The problem is that function doesn't sometimes extend to the mobile device, and probably it doesn't. Except Windows does. Your Windows device will support transactions, in the sense that I'm using them here. You can update stuff on Windows, and you can update stuff on your enterprise backend, with the guarantee that the Windows updates and the backend updates either both happen or none of them happen. Nice consistency thing. And that may be fairly critical. I looked on Android, not interested, Apple hasn't got it. So you might consider that linking up the activities on your mobile device and your back-end systems was important to you for data consistency. It certainly would make your application design easier, but now again it would force you into Windows. And if you don't do that, somehow, as I said earlier on, you have to worry about compensation on the back end. In other words, undoing the updates which you did because you haven't got the confirmation back from the user that it's happened. This always used to be something like the classic holiday booking thing. You booked your car, you booked your airline, you booked your hotel as separate things. And if you booked the car and then you booked the hotel but you couldn't get the flight, that means you had to undo the hotel, undo the flight, undo the car as distinct operations. Compensation.
But in general, you do have to do compensation.
And you do. Certainly if you don't have transactional support, you must do compensation. So in other words, that means that your back-end existing stuff will be transactional. You extend that support to the mobile device, it's not anymore. That means you have to put effort onto your back-end systems to introduce compensation actions. So not only are you coding user interface stuff for the device, not only are you coding the application code on the device, you're also altering the back-end mainframe enterprise things. Which may well be expensive or lack of talent or all this sorts of stuff. But who said writing enterprise transactions in a distributed mobile environment is easy? Yes?
Do you assume that if you start a transaction on your phone and then say you turn your phone off, are you assuming that means that transaction should be aborted?
Who knows?
Yeah, because you could just if it still happens, you just have to log back in to see if the results work.
Oh yes, you may. But are you going to enforce that?
Well, that's how it works, isn't it? So it's kind of enforced by default. So.
That could be a design technique that you wish to adopt. However, coming from the enterprise mainframe environment, the enterprise mainframe users would not put up with that.
Well, but this is not talking enterprise.
No.
Right.
I know, and this is the different paradigms and expectations between the two types of the communities. The enterprise users would not put up with that. They
I think like the person using the phone probably accept it.
might well do.
Yeah.
It might well do, and that is a critical decision that you have to decide upon. Bearing in mind, I've said enterprise apps for people within your own organisation. So it might well be that they are happy to do that. But going back to the picture, the big American baby boomers probably won't.
Yeah, that's just a cultural thing.
It's a cultural thing, yes. But this is why this topic is so interesting, because there is no right answer. There are just millions of questions that you have to come to a conclusion of one way or the other. And I've come to a conclusion based on my background experience, which I'm talking to you about. You will come to a different one, I'm sure. The development environment. So I talked about the runtime environment from the enterprise. The runtime environment should be capable of deploying apps with different screen sizes and changing the orientation from portrait to landscape. Or you might want to say enforce something. Interestingly enough, on the Windows mobile, they assume portrait. And if you turn it through 90 degrees, it doesn't alter the screen at all.
That's a finger size issue too.
And then there's a finger size issue as well, yeah. But for some reason or other, the Android development says don't assume portrait or landscape. And that's because it's coming out of telephony background. If you're on a tablet, well, most people tend to use it in portrait mode.
No. Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. But most people are right-handed, and I'm not. And it annoys me that I'm supposed to hold the thing in that hand, and I want to tap away like that. Whereas most people hold it like that and tap away on the keyboard like that. So there's the handedness issue as well. Anyway, so there's those sorts of accessibilities. Yes?
What difference does it make?
Believe me, it does. This is a typical left-handed person whinge. The world is designed for right-handed people.
But they're symmetrical iPads, aren't they?
Well, you hold it in your right hand, the left back button is on the left-hand side. Now that's fine for me. Right-handed people might not be. You sort of have to go over to the left. You have to sort of cross your hand.
You could read Japanese or Arabic and just...
Oh yeah, I don't care about that. Yeah, they go up and down and right to left. Yeah. But my friends in China have been talking to me about these kind of issues. And they like things to go top right to bottom right on their stuff. So they like their things to be in landscape mode because it gives more lines across. But they like going downwards and then completely the opposite way to the way Western things thinking. So if you're a national organisation, like IBM is, you would say to yourself, well, how am I going to cope with these various cultural differences? Well, I know Arabic has lots of funny things like this, even worse. So you might suddenly decide to say, well, I'm going to enforce American standards. And that may be fine, because you're in the same organisation, except somehow you upset the Chinese government and they come around and write nasty things in their official newspapers and you have to change things like Apple did on their guarantees. So if you're going multinational, you have a whole bigger set of user interface expectations. And you cannot assume orientation, and you cannot even just left to right where you present stuff. Anyway, the development environment should support JSON and XML, and I've said go JSON if at all possible. When your app is doing, ensure no data is cached on the device. Because if the device is stolen, your data can be read. Okay, I've encrypted everything. Sure, it shortens the window. But depending on your view of how a valid encryption is, that may or may not be secure enough for you. So the development environment should also be able to cope with various identification techniques, and if you're into that, deploy to different devices. And again, I'm putting my hand on my heart and saying IBM have got this product called WorkLight, which does this kind of stuff for you. I'm sure there are lots of others, but I'm not going to go into that. That's my plug for IBM. But that really means that whichever vendor you go to, these sorts of conditions can be satisfied. They all tend to work on standard Eclipse platforms.
But WorkLight likes hybrid.
Indeed, it does, and it will. And it will do all those devices I said no chance for you as well. But what I'm saying is that the major software vendors, which are coming up with solutions to some of these issues, and the development environment being based on standard Eclipse, will kind of say, oh, I want to deploy to Apple with this screen size, and I want to deploy to Android with that screen size. Which, interestingly enough, means you have to code to some sort of base common standard, I suspect. That I don't know very much about, but it wouldn't surprise me that if you are going to say, when you start your project up, I want to deploy generally, it might well restrict what you can code, which may be a problem. So that's a development environment. And I'm just going to say my standard thing here is, from a mainframe viewpoint, apps are not programs. In other words, the operating system is in control, it's usually object-oriented, and therefore it will let you do things at the time it thinks fit. And whereas if you're in a program, you do what you want when you want. And particularly multi-thread support, I think, is lacking a bit. There is no protection for locking race conditions or even runaway task. Runaway task means when something hogs the CPU, it gets into a tight loop for some reason or other. It's not very good at enforcing stops on that. Locking and race conditions, we talked about race conditions early on, and I don't think that's viable for an enterprise app. And there's also this restriction that the main thread can only reliably update the screen. And that's when I said in Android you can say I want the screen to be updated and sooner or later it will do it, but no guarantee. It's easier on Apple because you can issue a call which says switch me onto the main thread, update the screen, and therefore it will happen immediately. Are you disagreeing with me, sir?
Yeah, sorry. I think all user interfaces are generally single-threaded so that they can control the order that stuff's drawn, right? Is that right?
You have multimodal displays, don't you?
Yeah, but generally it's one thread.
You'll only be doing one thing at a time, typically.
Typically.
Because
but for example, if you start a thread off under Android and you want to update the screen based on progress, that is not as easy as you might expect.
That's why you have the single thread, so that's constantly looping over the CPU.
Yes, but of course every single design guideline that you may come up with said never ever do everything on the main thread. And for all sorts of reasons like the ones I've got here. So there is a bit of a problem here. And that's why I've talked earlier on about there ought to be decent thread control. And that's sort of what I was alluding to here.
There are plenty of academic programming language papers that explain why threading is a problem.
Indeed there are.
And it's not really a good model.
Indeed it isn't, except if you want to do something on the back end, you probably want a thread. And that's certainly what the Apple and the Android and even the Windows design guidelines say.
Yeah, I mean, you're not getting a choice. That's the problem, but
yes.
You already know it's a problem.
Yes, and in the case of you start something off and you go and hit the home button and select another app, okay, what's going to happen to that other thread that's running in the background? Are you assuming this is actually running, because at any point something can come back from the mainframe, or whatever? So all these design issues about threads are not trivial. And again, it adds to the complexity of your user interface. So whatever platform you choose, make sure you understand the thread model. And in iOS and Android, both of those are object-oriented things, and you essentially code override methods. And when those two operating systems decide they want to call your method, they will call it. You can't force call, therefore you have locking and race conditions and potentially stalls to worry about. Next thing is a security issue about what's the device actually doing. You may recall the Channel 4 program a few weeks ago, which was using the classic man-in-the-middle attack to do spoofing. And it showed just because it sort of looks like it's not doing anything, that is not the case. And if you're actually paying to use bandwidth, even more irritating, it's costing you to do that. For example, you can see that with Google Maps when it draws little lines on roads to tell you what the traffic's like. It's using it for that. Now, that's perhaps innocuous. What happens if you were working for the National Grid Transco with their secret location somewhere in Berkshire? And you're a nasty person and you look up some social media that says I work for National Grid, and you're using this kind of attack, you might suddenly notice that come 9 o'clock in the morning there's a lot of traffic driving into a given address. You might therefore deduce, this is the secret location which controls the UK's gas and electricity. So this issue is not trivial. So somehow maybe you want to turn this off. And the only reason you can turn it off is down at the operating system level. And the only way you're going to do that is use to have a customized version of it. You're not going to be able to do that with Apple. You can with Android, and you probably can get down at the OS level with Windows. So again, that might be something you want to think about. I've talked about bringing your own device and the perils of that. From your viewpoint is, you bring that into the company, they will look at everything they've got on it. And you don't have to be paranoid to worry about that. Indeed, exactly. From the other viewpoint, is you let employee devices in, you don't know what they're doing. Are they nicking your data? Are they introducing malware? Are they running an attack inside your firewall? All these kind of things. So in general, bring your own device is neither good for you or good for the organization. And I can have this prejudice again, that if you allow that, you're letting yourself become insecure and you deserve everything that happens. Now, I know this is fashionable, and I know this is a very old-fashioned state opinion, but it's something you have to worry about. Now, I know there is this opinion that the IT department always like saying no, and if they say yes, come back in 3 years and it will work, be there. But all these issues remind me very strongly of what happened when the first Apples and spreadsheets were around. Corporate IT couldn't cope with them. Departments and organisations running their own little spreadsheets to do things, and eventually they ran into problems and corporate IT took over. I think we're very close to that situation now. That if you let anybody do anything you like, the department writes their own apps and sticks it on something or other, problems will result. Do you disagree with me, sir?
Well, I think where different organisations do different things, it's different things work for different organisations.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
sometimes anarchy reigns.
Indeed.
Whether you like it or not.
I know, but I am saying that when anarchy does reign, somebody might have to carry the can.
There are ways of coping.
Indeed, there are.
There are strategies.
And there are management strategies.
You've got coming up. So.
I know, and I'm not going to address any of that. I will simply say, from my viewpoint, you let a foreign device in, it's bad news for the owner of it, it's bad news for you.
It can be, depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Indeed. And that, again, is a flaw in my argument, because I've not been general enough. But having said that, that's my opinion. So there we go.
You're going against the grain.
Yeah,
well,
I know.
If you're going to allow them to connect to the corporate network and have unfettered access, absolutely.
But you can't stop them having unfettered access.
You can stop them connecting to the corporate network.
In that case, you're actually allowing it even worse, to be honest. If you're allowing, if you've got them outside the firewall,
that's the place to keep them. If depending, it all depends what you're trying to achieve.
Indeed, indeed. But from my
and whether you trust the users.
I don't trust users. I never have. I was a systems programmer. I never trust applications or even users at all. I don't particularly see why I should change that view.
Whether you've got any kind of device management capability on those mobile devices which you trust, and whether you say, is it good enough? And
Yes.
It's all down to whether things are fit for purpose.
Indeed, and my viewpoint is they're not. Nothing vague about that. No, this is my conclusion. Because you do have to enforce things.
So one way of working is containerization.
Containerization, yes, but I have this view that
can provide an approach.
Yes.
Because you're putting effectively you're extending the reach of the enterprise to basically steal someone's processing cycles inside their private device and talk back for a secure tunnel back to base.
No, I don't think that's the right way to view it.
That's a model.
That is
There's
a model.
a number of all sorts of different models.
Absolutely right. That's one that I don't care for, though. For the reasons I've discussed. Who said this was you were going to agree with me? You're not. So but these are all the questions you kind of have to think about. So I'm not going to sort of air my prejudices about the three types of devices now. So Apple's really aimed at social networking and games, in my viewpoint.
They've done a lot in the latest versions of their OS to make them corporate friendly.
But can you therefore enforce your app onto those later type devices?
You can do things like have multiple VPN tunnels from an app.
Yeah, this is a technical solution to a user problem.
Yeah.
And my view, for whatever it is you can't, if you're using user devices you can't insist on anything. For all sorts of reasons, not that if the political one says person X has this and person Y has that, and X works and Y doesn't, that just upsets everybody. Anyway, but the operating system is an opaque, and I think it's very therefore difficult to customize it at the OS level for the reasons I've talked about. And we talked about earlier on.
I'm sure that's by design.
I'm sure it is, but because you're locked into Apple, and that's what they want control. But my viewpoint is that is perhaps something which is negative. From
the opposite viewpoint is also true, which is if you trust the OS,
I don't trust anything.
Then you might say it's a bad thing to let people to customize at the operating system level.
Yes, but bearing in mind my background is basically system software. And back in the good old days of system software, IBM actually distributed the source code for it. And you could quite happily get in and change it. And I did, and it was wonderful. And that led to all sorts of strange problems, especially when something went wrong when you said, phoned up IBM and they said, have you changed it? And you said yes, and I said, bye-bye. So these sorts of support issues come in. And then IBM changed to the fact of what's called object code only, you need to get the listings and source code to stop that happening. A good thing to do.
So your description of the mobiles being, the programming languages being a little bit like an exit.
Yes.
It's actually quite a good way of describing them, because if you then can trust the underlying operating system to whatever degree you feel you can throw it, then
that's changing my argument round against me, which I immensely approve.
Then what you're doing is you're saying, well, the people who are running the operating system are probably pretty clever people.
Yes.
And that will have been robustly tested reasonably well.
Yes.
And if people are writing the exits maybe aren't as clever, it doesn't matter so much because you're only giving them so much room.
That is absolutely true, and that is a wonderful counter-argument, and I stand abashed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the thing. The elements of trust here. Now, I suppose you could say, coming from a background where that absolutely happens, do my customers trust me as a coder? And the answer is probably.
As a systems programmer, absolutely.
Does if a systems programmer? So if a systems programmer found a bug, heaven help it, and it was the bug in my code, I always got very upset with myself about that. and I had one of the lowest coding failure rates when I was writing this stuff. But there's a whole bunch of people whose life and existence is to fix bugs. And the trust between the customers is between really the fixers, not the developers. Because the fixers have more contact with the end user customers, and they say, oh, give me the diagnostics, and they chug away through it and say, oh, did you do that, did you do that? So there are elements of trust there. However, my view on Apple, that's my view on Apple. And I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but this is what my view on it is. Android, I still think, is aimed at data access. Again, you would say telephony, but I'm talking about tablets here. It's very, very difficult to move and control the apps that come with it. Now, I've jailbroken my old Motorola tablet, so I can run in root mode, so I can put a firewall in there and stop all these miserable ads coming out all over the place. But I don't want some of the stuff that comes by default. I don't want a Facebook app, I don't want a Twitter app, and I just can't get rid of it without too much hassle. Yeah. So there's all of that. More attacks now come from Android than PCs. Earlier on in the year, Bournemouth University, I live in Bournemouth, had some open user sessions, and they were talking about these sorts of issues. And interesting enough, somebody from the National Police Squad came down and was talking about these kind of issues. And he said that he thinks that sooner or later, banks will refuse to refund your money if you've got a dodgy app on your device.
I'm beginning to go that way.
And they do.
With some of the T's and C's.
Yes. So I then immediately asked the head of Barclays, who was down there, about this. He said, oh, I can't imagine anybody being so unfriendly with that, of which the policeman kind of went, oh. So,
well, for example, they will strongly recommend that you use things like Trusteer.
Yeah, and I won't have anything to do with it.
Sorry, can I suggest that we see the end of the talk and take
Absolutely.
Yeah,
sorry.
So this is something about Android. And The Economist, the BBC was saying about 1 in 100,000 worldwide are infected, which is pretty small. But there again, if you say most of the attacks are coming from them, they're obviously quite potent and difficult to get rid of. You can replace the operating systems, such as like Tesco have done with the Hubble tablet. But is that a good use of resource, people resource, to write your own version of Android? Probably not. But there's lots of cheapo devices around there, so that's prices coming all the time. So that's a good thing. Windows, I'm talking about properly mobile, I'm certainly not talking about Windows RT. Mature, good skill levels. You know how to do things. Hardware costs are coming down, and it's compatible with existing PC applications. And you can do all customization stuff. So that's Windows. Now I'm going to take back to the picture again. Different ages, different backgrounds use devices in different ways. And right left-handed people do as well. And I've talked about accessibility and all the rest of it. So I'm going to come to a conclusion. And regrettably, it's Windows. So I've talked about banning all the devices, apart from one-use supply. We've talked about provisioning, light code, and user interfaces that are usable by everybody. Remembering that identification is going to be perhaps not as good as you expect. You can use hardware. Don't cache the data on the device in case it gets stolen and is encrypted. But more to the point, the transaction unit of work can get extended to the device. So that the device and the mainframe, your existing systems, existing enterprise systems agree. That's more one of the killer things. And customizing at the operating system level to get rid of these strange things. That's certainly easier to do with Windows, if you know how to do it. So my conclusion, for better or for worse, which really annoyed me when I came to it, was it's Windows. Proper Windows on a tablet. Why? Because, well, the hardware costs are coming down. Windows have bought Nokia, so their tablets are now coming out. Windows tablet with touch screen, around about £800 or so, price coming down. all the connectivity issues I've talked about, the provisioning I've talked about. You can all do that on Windows. Interestingly enough, the BBC said that Delta Airlines had decided they wanted to get rid of their bags that all their flight crew carry on, containing lots of data, and replace them with a Windows tablet. Why Windows? Better compatibility with what we've got already. So, surprise, surprise, it's Windows. And I was slightly surprised when I came to this conclusion, because I was thinking it was going to be Apple. And it's not. For enterprise stuff, it's Windows. So for an hour and 40 minutes, that's my conclusion. Thank you for arguing with me.
I think in view of the time, we won't take any questions now because there's an opportunity to talk afterwards. Hopefully our buffet is outside. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Roger Johnson if he'd say a few words. We've traditionally had the BCS president to address us in December, but this time Roger, who's our treasurer, is chair of BCS Council, which sounds like almost as good as the president. So let's hear from Roger.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I sat there for too long. It's gone to sleep. Can I keep it very short?
Yes, of course.
Yes, I've abandoned my slides, that's the first thing. The second thing to say is I'm hopelessly conflicted. I'm here, as it were, on behalf to say a word to you about the BCS, in the sense that as the sponsor, since BCS provides all the funds. I'm also conscious I'm in severe danger because I'm between you and the buffet outside, and as treasurer I've paid for the buffet outside for all of us to go out there and eat and drink it. So let me nonetheless say a word or two. BCS Council exists really as the voice of the membership. Many of you I saw on the sign-in sheet are members. The council is there to do two things, simply said. It's to advise the trustees, and secondly, we elect the trustees. The trustees are, firstly, people like the presidents, vice presidents, and trustee board, which is the executive body, also comprises 6 members of council, 6 ordinary members of council. Let me move to just give you a quick update on where the BCS is. Start with good news, is usually a good thing to do. The membership of the BCS, despite the recession, the membership is growing, and a few days ago it reached 75,000 members for the first time. We went up a few years ago very quickly from 40-odd thousand up to 70,000, and then it plateaued, and it's now moving up again. So 75,000, clearly I think we all dream of 100,000 simply because 6 figures is going to be better than 5. Things the BCS is doing, you will probably have seen in the BCS media and in some cases in the media generally. BCS is enormously active at the present time, very successfully, in totally transforming computing in schools. The Computing in School project, Computing at School, sorry, CAS, is achieving an enormous amount, both in terms of receiving funding, influencing Mr. Gove and the rest of the department for education and so on. In a way that I've not seen, and I've been involved in BCS in various elected roles for certainly, actually nearly 30 years. My very first post is the one I still have, which is as treasurer of this specialist group. And that the traction they're getting in transforming schools, bringing back programming in particular into the school curriculum, is something which I think is going to transform our profession when those people begin to move from school to university and actually out to work. Something that's not gone as well, some of you may have seen, BCS has always had a trading subsidiary. This was set up as BCS Learning and Development. It does examinations and activities of that sort, ECDL, the driving license. That was set up nearly 12 months ago as a separate trading activity. It was restructured. A new CEO is being appointed. The first CEO failed really to achieve the goals that he'd been set. And the importance of learning and development is that basically it's one of the key generators of income which enables the learned society part. If groups like this are part of the learned society activity, it funds this. And so success in the learning and development subsidiary is crucially important. That's been rapidly addressed, and an offer has been made to a new CEO who hopefully next year will be able to achieve the £1 million surplus, which is the sort of numbers that we need to look for from the trading activities. Some of you will have met, you'll almost certainly know the name of David Clark, who is the CEO, the group CEO in charge of both the professional institute that we belong to as well, and until the reorganisation was also in charge of the trading activities. David is finally retiring this year, having reached 60. I have a feeling he'll be 66 when he retires, but certainly it's a well-earned retirement. He's been with us for many years, and so later on in the summer, early summer hopefully, of 2014, we'll have a new group CEO, and that will also be important because it will inform the 3-year rolling strategy. BCS has a 3-year strategy, and the new strategy from the end of 2014 for the 3 years up to 2017 is being developed at the moment. If we'd had more time, I would have shown you the general structure of that strategy and talked a little bit about the particular aspects of that. Council, as the representatives of the members, representatives of you, had the first go at defining the new strategy. The strategy has a series of what BCS calls pillars, and under the pillars you then have strategic objectives. And we are reviewing those. We reviewed those in October, and they're now being updated. They will be discussed in trustee board and will come back to council at the end of this month. Sorry, the end of January, when council will have a go at reviewing and basically redefining the strategic objectives. So council very much at the heart of the organisation, particularly in that key strategic area. Another interesting development that is getting underway, a final new development, is at Sophia Level 3. Those of you familiar with Sophia, Level 3 is pretty much sort of straight out of university. And there, at the moment, we have huge numbers of people who are not level 5 in Sophia, which is the professional grade, the grade that is normally associated with CITP, for example. There is this large community, like all professions, or like the great majority of professions, we're a pyramid. And we've been working at level 5, and many of you will be members and fellows of the institution and CITP. The government is extremely keen to expand level 3, and there is money from the Gatsby Foundation, that's Lord Sainsbury, for the society to lead a major project to create what Gatsby is insisting is called a technician. I would prefer it to be technologist, and many people in the BCS would. But if someone gives you £1 million and says you'll call it a technician, I'm afraid you'll call it a technician. So there's a good deal going on, and there's a great deal more that can be said. My Deputy Chairman of Council, Kevin Streeter, is providing an update on Council's activities inside each issue of IT Now. Even if you don't read the rest of it, there is a one-page summary which Kevin is writing for each issue. We're trying to speed up the time between submitting the text and it appearing, but a quarterly council meeting and a quarterly journal don't mesh ideally. But there is a report of what we're doing. Finally, let me conclude just by saying that BCS Council is the voice of the membership. We are working hard to improve communication opportunities between people like you, who are the members and who, in the end, Council is answerable to. We're trying to improve those communications and are working hard on that, and later in 2014, Kevin Streeter will be bringing forward proposals for that. We are always looking for people to stand in the annual elections. Sadly, we're now just a month too late for you to stand this year, but if you are interested in coming onto the Council of the BCS to represent the members, there are two most obvious routes for doing that. One, every year, if you are a member, you'll be familiar with this, there are 4 or 5 members elected at large by the professional membership. And in addition, the specialist groups have 5 members on council representing groups like this. And 2 of those, the term is for 3 years. So most years there are 2 vacancies there. And I think Jeff will just have been notified that this year, unusually in our section, there are only 2 candidates for the 2 places. The branches, I think, have 6 candidates this year, and I've been told off the record that there are 9 candidates for 5 places in the membership at large. So the democratic processes in the society, I think, are working well. I'm getting thirsty and my tummy is rumbling, so I will stop at that point. If you have any comments or questions for me, I'll be around for a short while after the close, and I know Robert will be around as well. But let me not get any further between you and a well-earned drink and some nibbles.
Yes, thank you very much, Roger.